Let's talk about justice.
All right. So a couple of weeks ago, there was all this talk about the renewal of investigations into the post-election violence that took place in 2007, 2008. And there was all this hullabaloo and everybody got, essentially their knickers in a twist about what does it actually mean? Are we going to go into an investigation? Are the people's names going to be called out? Really, what will it be? That notwithstanding, even within the court system, there were still cases that were then before judges of the court and waiting on those decisions to be made. There were issues about neglect or failure to investigate, about cases which many pointed towards gender-based violence and rape and other kinds of sexual assault that occurred during this time of the post-election in Kenya. Now, there's still some cases before, and at that time when we started having this conversation, transitional justice expert Tina Alai told us that, we're waiting for December. If we get a decision on some kind of justice for these individuals who had brought their cases before court, it will be a good indication that even in the future, justice will then be served for those who've had to suffer because of this. That day came yesterday when the High Court made a landmark ruling and found the government of Kenya responsible for the failure to investigate and prosecute 2007 to 2008 post-election sexual violence in Kenya. Survivor petitioners in PE post-election trial 122 then were awarded 4 million shillings for violation of constitutional rights and some others. So there's some more details to this. But it's interesting that not less than a month that we spoke about this, then we see this ruling having been made today.
The thing about rape that is perhaps sometimes not highlighted, and what you've read highlights it. It's violence, but it's violence that is perpetrated through sex. And there are very few things that can be as heinous as that to an individual, irrespective of your gender, irrespective of your age, because it violates you in ways that nothing else can. And remember, crimes in this country that are committed violently, I believe they changed that particular law. I think it carried a death sentence at some point. But we no longer kill people, do we? No. That is how seriously it was taken. When someone robs you, we talk about robbery with violence, and we talk about people armed to the teeth and they rob you. Actually, rape is the same. You are robbing someone of something very fundamental to them. It's called dignity. It's not. You don't walk around with spare dignity.
No. Reserves.
Yes, and they are, exactly. And there aren't reserves where you can sort of like make an application and say, the one I had was depleted. I'm requesting for a new supply. So whenever a case like this is brought to the fore, in my mind, it is a clear sign that we are moving forward. That at least you're beginning, this is not a flicker of light. This is a full glare of light at the end of the tunnel. Now, I'm certain it will be appealed. However, the ruling has been made. And we can see it. But what I would like is for perpetrators to be pinpointed and for them to feel the full wrath of the law. That is what I would like to see.
That would, according to you, be full and complete justice.
It isn't complete. What would be complete is when we have a system that ensures that people who've suffered, now the perpetrators as well as the victims, let me just repeat this, both of them require psychosocial counseling. What is it that happens to your mind that you feel that you can violate another human being the way you do? Something isn't quite right in your head. Now, the person on whom the violence is meted, that person also requires help. We need something that ensures that both these, because someone who's perpetrated such a crime, what tells you they won't do it again? And what tells you that they will not acquire a sense of impunity? So it's something they feel they more or less have a right to do.
Let's bring in our guests, and this is Tina Alai. She is a human rights and transitional justice advocate, and Elizabeth Atieno. She is a survivor of the post-election violence of 2008. Tina, good morning.
Good morning, Eric.
It's good to have you again on the show. Welcome to the Situation Room.
Thank you.
Last time we spoke was still about post-election violence of 2008, was about the pursuit of justice for victims, especially of sexual violence in 2008. Now, here is a landmark ruling, and you mentioned this particular case, but just in passing. So just give us a brief of the highlights of this particular case, what was taken to court, and what the judge then said.
Thank you, Eric. Indeed, as you mentioned, this was a landmark decision made yesterday. Was filed as a constitutional petition by 8 survivors of post-election violence, sexual violence. So sexual violence that was committed during the PV. 6 of these survivors are female, 3 of whom were gang raped by GSU officers. The other 3 were gang raped by civilians, and 2 male survivors who were forcefully circumcised by ethnic militia. The 8 survivors were supported by 4 institutional co-petitioners, including Physicians for Human Rights, International Commission of Jurists Kenya, ICJ Kenya, Coalition on Violence Against Women, and Independent Medical Legal Unit. Now, the survivors brought this case at a time when the state had failed to put in place any kind of measures that would provide them, with justice, that would provide them with reparation. And they filed it in February 2013, just when the Truth Commission was about to complete its work. And particularly, the petitioners were seeking for 4 things. 1, they called on the court to determine that the state was responsible for the violations they had suffered because it failed to put in place measures to prevent the violence in the first place and to protect them from being sexually violated during the violence. Why? Because they indicated that the state had failed to properly train police officers to ensure that these police officers would conduct their policing from a human rights-based approach. Secondly, they called on the court to hold the state accountable for failing to provide them with protective measures even after they had gone through the violations, including some of them being sent away from certain health facilities when they reported that they had been violated by police officers. And in the long term, that up until when they were filing the case, and actually up until today, the government had failed to offer them any kind of comprehensive health care or psychological care and psychosocial support. And thirdly, they called on the court to hold the government accountable for failing to effectively investigate and prosecute the perpetrators who are responsible for their violations. And here, the petitioners elaborated numerous forms of potential accountability, bearing in mind that in a context such as post-election violence or conflict, while it may be challenging for you to identify your direct perpetrator, there are other layers of responsibility, including those who financed the violence, those who directed the attacks, and those who made those violations possible. So looking at responsibility both for the direct perpetrators as well as those who orchestrated the violence. And finally, they called on the court to hold the state responsible for failing to provide them with effective remedies, including compensation, rehabilitation, reform of laws that can ensure that no other person goes through similar violations, but that their harms are addressed. Just to conclude on what the case is about, whereas there were only 8 survivors who were present in court, the 8 survivors were cognizant of the fact that there were other thousands of survivors out there who would not be in the courtroom, and therefore they prayed for certain broader measures, including requiring that the government put in place a database that would document all victims of PEV-related sexual violence. They called on the court to issue an order that would require the government to set up a special body that would provide reparation to all of these victims and report back to court on how well reparations were being provided. And finally, they called on the court to order the government to set up specialized mechanisms for investigation and prosecution including mechanisms that would be independent of the police, especially because of the high percentage of sexual violence crimes that had been committed by police officers. So this is what the case was about. Obviously, the verdict that we have received only partially granted these prayers of the petitioners. Nonetheless, it still does stand as a symbolic decision, because for the very first time in more than 13 years since the violence occurred, this category of survivors have received formal recognition for the rights that were violated, and that the state has been called to account because it has been responsible for the violations, has been held to be responsible for failing to investigate and prosecute, and failing to provide protection measures, but only for 4 survivors out of the 8. And the distinction between these 2 categories of survivors is that the court has held, when it comes to petitioner 5, 6, 8, and 9, the state is accountable because in 3 of those cases, it is the state's own security officers who actually violated the survivors. And in the one case, the state is being held accountable because the survivor reported her claim, yet the state did not put in place effective mechanisms to ensure that her perpetrators were properly investigated and prosecuted. The other 4, unfortunately, the judge has determined that the state cannot be held responsible because the survivors were unable to prove that even though they had been violated by civilians, the state ought, or rather owed them, a special duty of care to be protected as individuals. And further to that, he claims that because they did not report, then the state's obligation could not have been triggered for the state to put in place effective measures to investigate and prosecute. But obviously, we find that there's a missed opportunity in that, which we can discuss a little further.
Sure. Even as we go into the details of this and then what this essentially means moving forward, we also are joined by one of the survivors who, before I go wrong here, has also been affected by this particular ruling. Was she one of the ones in court? And that's Elizabeth Atieno, who joins us this morning. Elizabeth, welcome as well.
Thank you so much.
So,
for
Elizabeth,
having me on the show.
Asante Sana.
Karibu.
What does this mean for you when you hear this, and what happened yesterday in terms of this decision? Take us through a little bit of what happened in your case and then what this means as of yesterday.
First of all, let me thank you people for having me on the show. And yesterday, yes, it was a landmark rule, but I feel like it's another start of it's a genesis of another journey, because the government has never been willing, from the word go, to even acknowledge that indeed something happened during the post-election period, and that women were violated, and women needed support. Women needed treatment. The government has never been willing to even accept that indeed it happened. For instance, my case, when I was sexually violated during the post-election period, I was only 16. I was even not able to report my case because I was gang raped by civilians. And at that time, I couldn't even access medical care because all the roads were blocked. I couldn't access the police station to report because there was no way I would walk out. I would be walking out there to go to report. There was nothing I could have done at that time. I didn't know who to tell. It is later on in 2012 that I came out and I spoke about it for the first time. It has not been an easy journey, because out of that, I got a child. And it was not easy having that child, raising that child. There was so much that needed to be done for me to accept that child. It is not easy.
In that time, if I may ask, Elizabeth, did you have access to any psychosocial counseling or any psychological help?
No, I did not.
So
it was only last year that I accessed psychosocial support. And I was supposed to have 7 sessions. And I did 4. And I'm remaining with 3. And the 3 are remaining because it is a session that I must make decisions. But back then, I never had that kind of support. And that terribly affected me. I was very bitter by myself, to myself. I was bitter to other people. I started using drugs, to just take that pain away, and it has not been easy. It is not easy at all. But I really thank God for where I am today, because it is not where I used to be, because I've become now an advocate for change, advocate for transitional justice. I am a self-agent, and I'm a HRD. I encourage other women to come out of the closet in case this is what has happened to them, because keeping quiet really kills,
How did you access social support, and where did it come from?
I access social support because of the people that we have at the transitional justice field. From where I work, I happen to be a volunteer of an organization called Grace Agenda.
Yes.
And Grace Agenda is one of the organizations that has been in the forefront to demand from the government justice for the women who were sexually violated during the post-election period. And now Grace Agenda is also a member of the National Victims and Survivors Network. So I got the support from the KTJN members, Tina being one of them, and they paid for my psychosocial support. They came together and paid for my social support, and that is when I accessed it. Yeah.
So, even with this landmark ruling, and this is a question for you, and then hopefully can continue with Tina. Is this enough, or is it a stepping stone? Because the things that you've talked about, even if there's a landmark ruling and there's some money then to be paid in terms of compensation, how much more is needed to actually get to a place where you can say, I'm coping with this on a daily basis, and I am encouraged that others in the country also can move forward?
So much is there that needs to be done. First of all, there must be willingness. Secondly, there must be accountability, because justice cannot come without accountability. Justice and accountability goes hand in hand. Because yes, I understand the ruling has been made. How many rulings for compensation have been made in this country, and nothing has ever happened? How many times has the court ruled on cases and the government does not even want to look at that? So for me, let me just say, I don't know if this time the government is going to act for me to feel like there is indeed justice, or if the government, because there are so many survivors outside there. We have recorded statements. Is the government also willing to compensate them, to reparate them? That is the big question here. Those were 7 cases that we had yesterday. There are a lot. In the working report, there are more than 2,000 cases of sexual violence that were recorded. Is the government willing to compensate to reparate those women. So for me to feel that indeed justice has been done, and to feel that actually I'm living in a just country, first of all, the government must be accountable. And it must acknowledge that it failed to protect its civilians at that time. There must be accountability.
Indeed.
There must be acknowledgement.
You'd asked the question, and Elizabeth has responded to part one of the question. The second part of the question, of course, goes to Tina Alai.
Yes, sorry. Did I miss the question?
So,
I
Tina,
thought Liz had responded. Yeah.
Sure, but I mean, here we are looking at, so this has been done. We're talking about 12 years later, right?
Yes.
This judgment has been given.
Yes.
For some, it might seem like a stepping stone to justice. For others, not quite enough, because there's no amount of money you can pay, for example, that would be enough to cover that. But is it a stepping stone? Is it taking us in the right direction? Because we still have thousands, hundreds of other cases that will be before courts, before judges. Is it a stepping stone?
It absolutely is a stepping stone, though. I think when we look at it in the broader context, what this judgment has succeeded in doing is to bring this issue back to the fore. Remember, just as Liz is sharing, this category of survivors have been silenced, they have been ignored, they have been neglected for the past 12 years. And it's not just this particular category of survivors from the post-election violence, but also the reality for victims of GBV every day. So what this judgment is reminding us is that sexual and gender-based violence is just as much a violation as any other form of violation that we may acknowledge as a society. So in the first instance, it's bringing this issue to the fore. It's providing a form of formal recognition for the survivors, and enabling us as a society to reflect, take stock. What are these discriminatory stereotypes and biases that have led us first to permit these violations to happen, second, to condone and just tolerate them, like everything is all right about it, and obviously now challenging impunity for these violations, for sexual and gender-based violence, and also for political violence. But obviously, the journey ahead is still quite long, because we are challenging a system that does not readily appreciate that these violations ought to be repaired in the manner that survivors would like it to be done. So there'll be a long journey to enforce the orders for the four survivors who got the compensation. We know that many other cases have been determined, such as this. The cases of Nyayo House Torture Chamber, for example, it took survivors years on end to eventually get the damages paid off by the Office of the Attorney General. We know that it's not going to be that quick to get the damages, but the damages can never repair what these survivors have encountered. It is merely a recognition that somebody ought to at least acknowledge what happened. Now, what about the other four? Obviously, from where we sit, and of course we will be doing further analysis as we just received the judgment late yesterday afternoon to determine are there grounds for appeal. But obviously the decision has missed an opportunity to ensure that survivors like Liz, who experience numerous barriers to reporting cannot be the yardstick that is used to be able to afford survivors justice.
That's
If
indeed
in
the truth.
fact, if at all, there must be measures that are put in place to ensure that the context is conducive for survivors to be able to come forward and receive adequate reparations, as well as proper investigations and accountability against perpetrators.
Let's continue the conversation with Tina Alai and Liz Atieno. Liz is a sexual violence survivor of the 2008 post-election violence. Tina Alai is a human rights and transitional justice advocate. Very big ruling that came out of the High Court yesterday. Justice Weldon Korir ruled that the government failed citizens by not taking measures to protect them during the violence that rocked the country, and which resulted in violation of their human rights, injuries to their bodies, and psychological torture. So this is a case that has been taken to court by 8 sexual violence survivors of the 2008 post-election violence. 3 of them went to court saying that had been raped by GSU officers. 3 had been raped by civilians. 2 men then they said they had been circumcised by militia, and all this is violence of a sexual nature. So the judge gave out a ruling yesterday, and this is what we are discussing today. As we were going into the break, Tina, you were saying, I mean, we have seen how long it's taken for those who had won cases for compensation because of the torture that they had gone through in the Nyayo House torture chambers, how long that has taken, in fact, even for the compensation to start even appearing to be a possibility. So even for this particular one, you're aware and you're alive to the fact that, I mean, this is a long journey. This is just the beginning of one long journey, and we still have a long way to go. At the same time, though, looking at the what the 8 had taken to court, they wanted the state to be held responsible for failing to protect them, to be held accountable for failing to protect the citizens after the violations by offering them, kind of support, including psychosocial support. And Liz Atieno is telling us she did not receive until last year is when she received support. Wanting the state to be held accountable for failing to investigate and prosecute the perpetrators, wanting the state to be held accountable for failing to provide effective remedies, and this includes compensation, rehabilitation, or even reforms in terms of legal reforms to ensure that such things do not happen again in the future. So this is one win, but there's still a long journey. What could the next steps look like?
I think the next steps would be for us to, we will be observing first, obviously, how the National Police Service, Inspector General of Police, the Office of Director of Public Prosecutions, the Office of the Attorney General, even the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, the particular steps that they will take to now activate credible investigations for these 4 cases. Let's begin there. For what we have, for these 4 cases. But looking beyond these 4 cases, if you were to situate other survivors out there who are like these 4 survivors, let's take the fact that you were violated by state security officers. What the court is saying, although the justice made it very clear in his judgment that, sorry, I'm not going to give any orders for any survivor who's not before me because the violations occurred under the repealed constitution, which did not provide an opportunity for public interest litigation. That was his determination. So unfortunately, he did not make orders that can be extended automatically to other survivors out there. Nonetheless, the writing is on the wall. If you were sexually violated by a state security officer, what the judge has said is, you're like this 4. The state owed you an obligation because it's their agent that violated you. If you reported your case to the police, like one of these survivors did, and nothing has been done to date, the state violated your rights because of the obligations that they owed you to effectively investigate and prosecute. And therefore, I dare say, I would mirror this judgment and observe or challenge the state mechanism not to wait for another 10, 20, 100 survivors to have to struggle through 13 long years in a courtroom before they can actually live up to their obligations to properly investigate. And here, when we're talking about investigations, let us not put a high burden, a high evidentiary burden on these survivors. Many of them are not going to be able to identify their perpetrator. Does that mean they do not have justice? No. The law, our law, is clear, including the Penal Code, the International Crimes Act, which in the previous investigations we failed to use. We hope to see that the investigations will be conducted taking into account the context of conflict-related sexual violence and move beyond looking just for the direct perpetrators to, when we're talking about state security, we want to find out who were the commanders of these battalions, can they be held accountable? When it comes to civilians, we want to find out, were there political actors who facilitated violence by ethnic militia who were forcefully circumcising, for example, the 2 male survivors in this case? Were there political actors who directed their attacks at other civilian communities? Some other players, besides direct perpetrators, must also.
Let me ask this question. 13 years, 12 years down the line, the evidence trail at best will be cool, not necessarily cold. What is it within our laws? What do we have within our laws that will enable someone to actually genuinely seek and find justice in a case like this? Because time definitely has eroded that particular process. It's not that it has extinguished it, but it has eroded it.
So the reality, thank you for that question, CP. The reality Kenya is not the only country, or it's not the first country to have grappled with this challenge.
No.
In fact, many other contexts around the world, you barely have any other evidence to work with but the survivor's statement, right?
Yes.
And so when we look at the reports, such as those that were released by the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions in 2015, saying, sorry, we are unable to prosecute because victims do not have corroborating medical evidence, they're unable to identify their perpetrator. In a conflict context, whereas that would be helpful to help you build a very strong base and hopefully identify a direct perpetrator, in most conflict contexts, you're looking for the next level of responsibility, which shows you what were the patterns of the violations. How widespread were they? Which actors seem to bear a higher responsibility? And so, for example, when you look at the Waki Commission, that's already quite some substantive lead in terms of the types of levels of accountability that you're looking for. But I would hasten to add that criminal accountability is quite challenging to pursue. You would have numerous levels. There are a lot of intricacies before you finally arrive at saying so-and-so would be held responsible for either directly perpetrating or facilitating the commission of that. But also, some survivors know who violated them.
That was the question I was going to ask Liz just now.
Know.
But Liz, and where she is, because Liz has told us this morning, and Liz, as you're here as well, you, unfortunately, were gang raped by civilians. As painful as it might be to remember, do you know who raped you?
I don't know, to speak the truth. Because of that, I was gang raped by, it was a gang of men. Up to now, I know their faces, but I've never seen any one of them after that. I've never met any one of them after that.
Had you seen them before?
Pardon?
Had you seen them before? Are they people that you had ever seen
before
around
that
you?
incident, I have never seen any one of them. I had never met any one of them. I had never seen any one of them. I remember the face of the one who came before me. Because surrounded, they had their leader. And it is that face that I remember. But the rest, I don't know.
So now when we're looking at justice, there are two things. Because now it's not a matter of what would you prefer, but what would be most comfortable now? Are we looking at saying, compensate me because these individuals, I don't know who they are. I'm not able to give evidence. Just like Tina is saying, evidentiary responsibility then should not now rest on your shoulders. Because we're talking about 12 years. You can't remember who these individuals were. Maybe if you saw a face, you could get some recollection. So what are we saying then makes this worth it? Number one, enhancement of security in the country for the civilians of the citizens of Kenya, or the compensation in terms of monetary award. Which makes this make more sense in terms of steps towards the completion of justice? For you right now, is it that you would prefer to feel more protected, or you would want these individuals to be brought to book, or you're all right with the compensation?
First of all, let me just acknowledge that there is no amount of money that can ever repair those 12 years. No amount of money that can ever restore my dignity that was taken away from me. No kind of whatever thing can bring me back to the 12 years of pain and suffering, and maybe the pain ahead of me. There is nothing that can compensate that. Nothing can repair that. It is just the same way I come right now to that station and I tear your dress. I must repair it, but it cannot go back to the way it used to be. It is the same way. I would want to feel more protected and more safe. Because every day I've got a certain fear inside me that maybe one day my daughter might end up being a victim again. Because a lot of things are happening, even during this COVID period. We've had cases of women being raped by the police. I would want to feel safe wherever I am every time. But at the same time, I would want to feel there is accountability, there is justice that has taken place. So all of the questions that you've asked me, they go hand in hand. There is nothing that I can choose there that is more superior than the other. I want to feel safe.
Yep.
I want justice. I would want reparation. Though I have mentioned previously that no form of any reparation can amend the damage that has been done. But at least it can soothe the pain. Yes.
Liz,
so for me...
sorry, finish. Just go ahead, please.
So for me, I would say I would want to feel safe. I would want my children to be in a safer environment, feeling protected. I would want justice. I would want accountability from the government. I would want someone to take responsibility of the PEV. And I would want reparation. So there is no... And during the TJRC, when the TJRC report came out, it recommended for sexual violence. It was the second class. The survivors of sexual violence were given second class reparation. Because the people who had lost life, they were first, then we came second.
Yeah.
All of those things were recommended by the TJRC, including acknowledgement and including what was that? Including it was acknowledgement and apology from the government, from the president and from the IG.
So, Liz, when you say that you'd like, for example, the government, first of all, to acknowledge and take responsibility for what happened to you and others like you. And I'd assume that this would be like, for example, a public statement from the top leadership of the government coming to say, we acknowledge that this happened and we take responsibility. When you say accountability, that somebody should be held accountable, or the government should be held accountable, in what form would you like to see this?
Investigations must be carried out. Because there is no way you want to tell me that Kenyans woke up one morning and went crazy, started butchering each other. People started raping women left, right, and center because Kenyans went mad. Someone was behind the wheel somewhere. And that someone is walking around outside there, scot-free.
Yeah.
Don't you think that we are headed to a more bigger crisis if we don't look for a remedy for this one? Someone must be held accountable, because it is indeed it is someone that indeed organized and that is why we saw all those violations happening. It is not Kenyans who went crazy. It is someone who organized groups to do this and that out there. So that is why I would want accountability. And accountability will come if only proper investigations are done. Without investigation, then there is nothing. We are headed nowhere.
Yeah.
It is only investigation that can bring people to book and justice can be served.
City.
There was this mention of credible investigations. What would you say are the tenets? What are the qualities of a credible investigation? One which passes the muster, and you can say, okay, fine. From these findings, the process that was followed is what ought to be followed. So you would be happy with the findings, irrespective of whether it tends to lean in the direction you'd like it to, but the process that was followed. What are these that must be done?
Number one, there were those hotspots at that time that a lot of violation happened. It's a time now to go back to those hotspots. I understand that there are some wounds that are going to be opened, and it is going to be very painful. I know. But for a wound to heal, it must first be operated on, cleaned. And that is when the wound can heal. So there were those hotspots. It's a high time to go back to those hotspots. Start investigating from the people who are there at that time. I think that is the number one procedure. And this investigation must be carried out, if possible, by an independent unit. Because I don't want to believe that the police will go investigate their colleagues, what their colleagues did in some areas. I don't believe that justice will be served there. First of all, the body that will investigate must be very independent, with very good experts in investigation. Go to those hotspots, start asking questions, and start investigating. Number two, there were those areas that the police were deployed. In the case of women, where women were raped by state agents, the question to ask, who was the commander at that time? Because when this JSU comes on the ground, they've got their leaders. Who was where at that time? During that time, we have the DCs, the PCs. Who was in charge at that time? Who was in charge who was the OCS of a certain station in that area? Those are now the questions that we need to, that body that might be selected needs to do. Those are some of the things that they need to do. And those are the questions that they need to ask.
Akil, I would take it even further and ask who was the PS in charge of the interior at that particular time? Who was the minister in charge of the interior at that particular time?
Now, those are the questions that needs to be asked, and those questions, they've got answers. Because if I go back to books, I will see, like where I was gang raped in Kariobangi. Who was the OCS at that time in Kariobangi? Where was the police when because these militia groups, they came in lorries. It is all of a sudden that people came out with pangas. My goodness, I normally don't understand up to now how a group of men would organize themselves with new pangas, with new rungus, and they would be walking around without no question. Because that day when I encountered that group, their weapons were new. I can identify a new weapon, and I can identify a used weapon. They had new weapons. They were walking in public at that time. Nobody was asking them any question. They went around butchering people, raping women. Those are some of the questions. Where was the police? Where was the state at that time?
So, Tina, in terms of investigation now moving forward, because these are questions obviously that would make up part of this investigation in terms of depth. It would also seem that there would have to be interest on part of the state then to enter into such investigations. Are we seeing the possibility of that taking place, no matter how long it takes?
Well, obviously now the court has given an order that requires the investigating mechanisms to take action. Well, he has not directed them to do so, but he has determined that by failing to do so, they have violated the rights of these four petitioners. The reality indeed is this. If we don't, we are setting ourselves up for repeat cycles of political violence in this country. Look at 2017. The only difference you have between 2017 and 2007, 10 years apart, is that the violence was not as widespread. But unfortunately, the very same patterns of election-related sexual violence were repeated yet again. Same script. Look at the documentation of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights in a report, Silhouettes of Brutality. In a short period of time, they were able to document at least 201 cases of sexual and gender-based violence committed between August and October 2017, when we were having the initial as well as the fresh presidential election. 50% of these cases were committed by state security officers. 50%. And why? Because the perpetrators keep getting emboldened time and time again. We did nothing in 2007, even though we knew that state security officers were involved. And because of that, in 2017, they felt emboldened again. I pray, tell me, why wouldn't they do it again in 2022? And that is why we're saying, as challenging as it is, we must confront impunity. Obviously, the criminal threshold must be one that will have to be met, and we start from the base. Who can be identified, who was a direct perpetrator, and we keep moving up the layers. But let us begin to see some action. So the ball is in the state's court. But as Kenyans, those who support these survivors, and all Kenyans of good conscience, I think it's time for us to put our heads out for the sake of our country and begin to demand that our institutions work for us as required under the Constitution.
Very well said and very well put. Thank you very much, Tina. Tina Alai is a human rights and transitional justice advocate. We've also been speaking with Elizabeth Atieno. Elizabeth is a sexual violence survivor of the 2007-2008 post-election violence. She was gang raped and she has gone through the trauma of that. She got a baby out of that experience. She has taken a long time to start healing, not yet healed, but at least now she says she's at a point where she's accepted. She's at a point now where she is starting to deal and confront with that. Ladies, we want to thank you very much for speaking to us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.